Well, welcome everyone. My name is Flag Taylor. I teach in the political science department at Skidmore College, which is a liberal arts college in upstate New York. And I'm also on the academic council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I'm actually down here at the in Washington, D.C. at the foundation right now. They have a wonderful museum. If any of you get a chance to come to Washington, I encourage you to come see the VOC museum. It's right near the White House, and they have an amazing collection of artifacts and things for you to see. Today, what I want to talk to you about is totalitarianism, the nature of that term, and why it's crucial to understanding communism. We're going to discuss both the theory of totalitarianism and what that term is meant to convey, why a novel term was invented in the 20th century to describe communist regimes. And so I hope you become quite familiar with the variety of means employed by communist regimes to achieve their political and ideological goals, and why these regimes felt compelled to use these tyrannical measures. I'll say at the outset, I have a couple PowerPoint slides to share with you at various points during my lecture, and I'll try to leave a few minutes at the end of our time together to answer some questions. So if you would, while I'm talking, if you think of questions that occur to you, you should type them into the chat function, and then I'll open the chat function at the end of my lecture when we have a little time left, and hopefully I can answer some of those questions during that time. So first, let's talk about the history of this term totalitarianism. The term was originally coined by a critic of Italian fascism, but then Benito Mussolini liked the term and he picked it up to describe his own enterprise. He liked it well enough that he thought it was actually a good description of what he was up to. And so here's how he defined it. Mussolini said, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. It's a pretty good definition. Defined strictly, a totalitarian regime is one that bans all social and political activity that is not expressly approved by the state. So these regimes aspired to a kind of total control of their population. They want to create a completely unified society. The term gained its greatest prominence in the latter half of the 20th century after the publication of a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism by the philosopher Hannah Arendt. That book was published in 1951. Now to the substance of the term, and here I'm going to use three thinkers primarily to describe the substance of the term. Carl Friedrich is one, Raymond Aron is the second, and Hannah Arendt is the third. And the primary purpose of the term is twofold. First, to point to a basic commonality between Nazism, fascism, and communism, and then point to the novelty of the phenomenon, to point to the fact that these tyrannies in the 20th century were unlike the tyrannies of the past. And both of these claims were somewhat controversial. For it's quite common to this day, right, to think of Nazism as primarily a right-wing phenomenon and communism as a left-wing phenomenon. And those sympathetic to socialism object, of course, to the assertion that they have any connection to something like fascism or Nazism. But nonetheless, the term gains wide currency and it's still in use today. So let me pull up my screen here and just remind you of the novelty point. Here we go. So again, you have the idea that Nazism and communism and fascism share significant features. They're all species of the same genus. And also, again, to point to the idea that there's something new going on in these tyrannies of the 20th century that hadn't quite happened before. The other way to think about this is to remember just the sheer level of violence and the manner in which that violence was unleashed in the 20th century. in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, these mass political movements took hold of political and social institutions. And in both these countries, the leaders had these grand, even unprecedented ambitions for their populations, and even for ambitions for mankind in general. And so these transformative ambitions, these movements that meant to transform the human condition, seem to have no analogs in the history of tyrannical governments in the past. And so let's look at two attempts at a kind of systematic definition that would allow for some precision in designating a particular regime as totalitarian. So here are these two definitions, one by Carl Friedrich and the other by Raymond Aron. You see with the Friedrich definition, you have this official ideology, this that covers all aspects of man's existence. You have the single mass party that's devoted to implementing the ideology. And then you have this near monopoly on communication, armed combat, etc. And then at fifth, in Friedrich's scheme, you have a system of terroristic police control that is directed against open enemies of the regime and anyone even suspected of being an enemy. I would say the Raymond Aron definition is pretty similar, right? He also numbers 1 and 2 in his scheme, right, relate to Friedrich's number 1, right? They emphasize the importance of the ideology. He also emphasizes, right, the monopolistic control that's exercised over different aspects of the society. And finally, with number 5, he comes back to the importance of ideology, in that mistakes that are made in professional activity or economic activity are seen as ideological faults, right? And so I think there's some nice overlap between these two definitions, and they each get at something important about the nature of a totalitarian regime. And both of these thinkers, I would emphasize too, want to argue that for a regime to qualify as totalitarian, it has to possess all 5 of these categories. And I think it's fair to say that the despotic regimes, say, of ancient China or Rome under the emperors, or even the absolute monarchies of modern Europe, those regimes are tyrannical, but not totalitarian in the sense that Friedrich and Aron mean here. Now, I want to bring us to Hannah Arendt. Her understanding of totalitarianism is a little different from these two thinkers, because she attempts to identify a true essence of totalitarianism, right? She doesn't want to just make a list of certain characteristics, but she wants to say, well, there's 1 or 2 characteristics were most important above all the others. And she says the basic experience of totalitarian domination is terror. The basic experience of totalitarian domination is terror. And now I want to explain why that's the case in Hannah Arendt's view. So think of it this way: an ordinary tyranny, right, is defined by lawlessness. There is the ruler exercises his authority in a completely discretionary and arbitrary manner. It's not guided by laws, and he's often guided by mere appetite and desire, whatever he thinks he can do to aggrandize himself and his friends. So you can think of Roman emperors like Nero, right, would fit this description. Now, what Hannah Arendt argues is that totalitarian regimes are different because they claim to be, and she means this very precisely, they claim to be the most lawful regimes in human history. Now, she doesn't mean lawful in the sense of abiding by the dictates of their own laws, right? If you look at the Soviet Constitution of 1936, for example, you'll see all sorts of nice rights guarantees, guarantees and protections that the Soviet Union never felt inclined to act upon. What she means is that these regimes claim to be guided unequivocally by the laws of nature or the laws of history. They claim to establish perfect justice on earth. I'll just give you one quote where I think she explains this very well. Such regimes claim, quote, to transform the human species into an active, unfailing carrier of a law to which human beings would only passively and reluctantly be subjected. So in the case of communism, the idea is that the Communist Party rules in the name of the proletariat, right, the working class. And they rule the name of the proletariat because history with a capital H has decreed that this has to be the case, right? So Marxist-Leninist doctrine claims to have studied history and have this scientific understanding of history such that capitalism is destined to be destroyed and communism is destined to replace it. And so members of the Communist Party then are merely translating the immutable laws of history into action. They're the agents of history would be the other way, would be the other way to put it. And it's this appeal to history, this sense that they really understood history scientifically. This is what gives and gave communists enormous confidence in the ultimate justice of their cause. It made them quite willing to endure and inflict terrible suffering and violence as long as they thought it was advancing this movement of history. This had a kind of intoxicating effect on party members, and of course, it attracted many people to the communist movement. And so once those laws of history are applied to human beings, this is what Arendt argues results in terror. She says, quote, terror seeks to stabilize men in order to liberate the forces of nature or history. It is this movement which singles out the foes of mankind against whom terror is let loose. And so again, the idea is that history gives us objective enemies. So in the case of communism, the objective enemy is the bourgeois class, anyone suspected of owning property, having some connection to a kind of bourgeois middle class education. In the case of Nazism, of course, the objective enemy, first and foremost, would be the Jewish people. And so terror has to be unleashed on these enemies because that's what's necessary to move history forward, to move us to this realization of perfect justice. And so these people are convicted of being enemies, really not for something that they have done, right? But for something, but for who they are. They're guilty of being members of a particular class in the case of communism, or they're guilty of being members of a particular race in the case of Nazism. But in each of those cases, right, the so-called objective enemy has to be erased. It has to disappear. So just give you one concrete example of this. This logic was the justification for the Soviet terror famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. It's called the Holodomor. This was the starvation and deportation of the so-called kulaks. Kulak is a Russian term meaning something like wealthy peasant. Such people were standing in the way of the collectivization campaign that Stalin had undertaken, and history therefore decreed that this class had to be rooted out. There's a wonderful film that takes up this as its subject. It's called Mr. Jones. It's from maybe 2019, 2020, something around there. But it's a very moving film about the Holodomor and a journalist who went from Great Britain, traveled to Moscow and Ukraine to report on this famine. Another example of what Arendt is talking about would be the oppression of anyone who had a vaguely bourgeois background in Central Europe in the early 1950s. And this oppression could take the form of lots of different things, but maybe a sentence to a labor camp, the mere loss of a job, or the prevention of the education of one's children. And again, all this oppression was based on the purportedly objective criteria of your membership in the bourgeois class. Communist parties all over Central Europe, countries like Poland, Hungary, former Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, they took this quite seriously and sought to make sure in very concrete terms that nobody with a bourgeois background would be in a position to influence society in any way. It was an astonishing feat of social engineering. And I have a kind of interesting document here that kind of illustrates what this looked like. So this is in the Czech language, and it's basically a kind of agenda for a meeting of a local Communist Party in December of 1948. So this is about 10 months after the Communist Party took power in Czechoslovakia in a coup. So they took power in February of 1948. So this is in December of 1948. And here's the translation. So as you'll see, what the document points to is the immediate need to hire people like teachers, policemen, judges, but it makes it explicitly clear that only people with a minimal education would be permitted to take on these jobs. And so anyone with a bourgeois background, anyone who might have owned some property or perhaps owned a shop or perhaps was relatively decently educated, right? They would be excluded from occupying any of these jobs. So imagine this same process occurring all over the country in various regions and towns, and you have an idea of the scale and thoroughness of the social engineering that occurred that I was just mentioned. So you have her idea that terror is what it's kind of the basic experience of totalitarian domination. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is it that guides the application of terror? And that something is ideology. And in my view, this is absolutely the most important concept in understanding communism, ideology. Now, the problem is that the way that this term ideology is used and understood today presents a significant obstacle to appreciating this aspect of communism. So let me explain kind of what you have to get out of your head in order to appreciate this argument. Think about the way that you often encounter this term ideology. Sometimes we speak in casual conversation, right, as if everyone subscribes to an ideology. We often mean something like worldview, right? It's a grouping of kind of cultural and political views that we all have our personal lens through which we view the world, but we don't really kind of formalize it in any explicit way. But it's still there as a kind of worldview that we use. So that's one way we often use this term. The other way is the other way you encounter this term is in political science textbooks, I would say, sometimes history textbooks. So in more academic settings, if you look at these textbooks, you'll often find a list of words that end in the letters ISM, right? You'll have a kind of list of isms. So often liberalism, feminism, conservatism, socialism, capitalism, libertarianism, right? So anything that ends in these letters is grouped under this genus of ideology. And so here, right, the ideology understood in this way is something more explicit and formal. But I want to suggest that both of these ways of thinking about ideology will prevent you from appreciating what communism really is. And so communism can't be understood merely as a kind of point of view in the casual way, but nor is it just a kind of semi-formal collection of political principles or preferences. Communism as an ideology is something more profound, something more complex than that. Think about the point I mentioned with respect to Hannah Arendt's argument a few minutes ago. Communism makes extraordinarily ambitious and comprehensive claims about the realization of justice on earth. They thought their political program was going to actualize this scientific understanding of historical law. And once capitalism was destroyed and communism came into being, right, this reign of communism would bring about perfect equality and perfect justice. And so you have to remind yourself that level of ambition is not the case with other things that are often called ideology, right? These other isms don't make similar claims. The other way to think about this, remind yourself that the Bolsheviks, the communists in the Soviet Union, they spoke quite openly about creating what they called a new Soviet man. And so they really thought a new human being would be created once this new political order would be put in place. Human nature would reveal itself in ways it just had never revealed itself before on the face of the earth. An early communist writer called Maxim Gorky in 1917 said this. He said, "The new structure of political life demands from us a new structure of the soul." Right? That's the level of ambition. That's the level of transformation that they were aiming at. And so if you think about ideology in the way that I want you to appreciate, these are a few definitions that I think do a better job of kind of getting at communism as an ideology than these other ways we think about it. The first one is one that I came up with. The second one is probably my favorite, the Besançon definition, right? A doctrine that in exchange for conversion promises a temporal, right, an earthly salvation that claims to conform to a cosmic order whose evolution has been scientifically deciphered and requires a political practice aimed at radically transforming society, right? So again, it's this ambitious theory which dictates a precise political practice, which will get us to that that theory. And so this comprehensive political philosophical doctrine, right? That's something that makes communism and Nazism, right, different from these things that we usually also call ideologies. We can also look at the distinctive nature of communist ideology by thinking about the Communist Party and what it did. This is a Communist Party card of a Czechoslovak party member. This was issued in 1945, and it included this communist decalogue, these sort of 10 commandments of a good communist. And I'll just throw these up on PowerPoint slide here and let you look at those. But if you kind of linger on a few of those, you'll appreciate the need that it emphasizes, the need to always keep the party foremost in one's mind, to strive to act in accordance with the principles in all facets of your life. So this was something that was going to define your conduct, every minute of every day. And so this is something quite different from a membership card that you would get from, say, the Democratic or the Republican Party or an ordinary European party today. Want to make one more point, and then we'll get to your questions. Think about the other aspect of ideology. The other way to think about what an ideology does is that it's something that prepares people to play whatever role they are designated to play by the party or the state. And so it isn't really about convincing people of the merits of communism. Rather, it provides a kind of comprehensive behavioral instruction. It's what justifies the role that the party is supposed to play in history. And so this is something that can never be abandoned, no matter how evident it might become that the promises of communism are not being realized. So it doesn't matter that those in power believe the ideology or they don't. They know that this is what legitimizes their role. They have no other basis for exercising their authority than the ideology, so they have to cling to it to preserve the status quo, to preserve their authority. So it's really the basis of the legitimacy of the system as a whole. And so I would suggest that ideology is not just one feature of a totalitarian regime, but it's perhaps the most important feature, right? Remember, it's this body of doctrine that covers all aspects of one's existence. But it's the essential feature of a communist regime, because totalitarianism is actually the result of the adherence to this ideology. So one thinker, Alain Besançon, puts this point the following way. He says, totalitarianism is the political consequence of the ideology. It is chronologically and logically first. So he's pointing out that communism is totalitarian precisely because it's an ideological regime. It makes these ideological claims about history, about human beings, about human nature. It commits itself to a particular political program in terms of how to transform history, transform human nature. And that program requires the use of totalitarian means. And I think this is something that is convincing in part because I think some of the more famous dissidents who lived under communist tyranny actually agree with Besançon's point. I'm thinking here of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the author of the Gulag Archipelago, famous Russian dissident, and the famous Czech dissident Václav Havel. Both Solzhenitsyn and Havel wrote very movingly about what it was like to be under the thumb kind of ideological domination. They both emphasize the importance of feeling like you were constantly forced to lie living in a communist regime. Havel has this wonderful example of a shopkeeper. He has a famous essay called "The Power of the Powerless," and his famous metaphor in that essay is this guy who goes to work every day. He's the manager of a fruit and vegetable store, and he puts the sign up in the window, "Workers of the world unite." And Havel says, well, does this guy really believe that the workers of the world are going to unite? No. Why does he put the sign up? He puts the sign up to keep himself out of trouble, right? He puts the sign up in his window because he knows that's what he's supposed to do. He knows that's the message that he's going to send. So he becomes habituated to lying, to saying things he knows aren't true, but he does it again to kind of preserve himself in the midst of the ideological fantasies of the communist regime. I think that's a good place to stop. So I'll stop sharing my screen and see if you have any questions in the chat. I'd be happy to talk about anything I mentioned in my lecture. If not, I'm happy to let you go a little early. So maybe I'll just give you a minute or two to see if anything occurs to you is worth digging into a bit more. All right, if there are no questions, I guess I'll say goodbye. I hope you all have a chance to come down to Washington to visit the Victims of Communism Museum. And my email address too is on the Skidmore website. So if something occurs to you later, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.